Hold your right hand up in front of your face right now. Palm turned toward you. Look at two fingers, the index finger, the one you point with, and the ring finger, the one sitting next to your pinky. For most people alive today, one of those two fingers is clearly longer than the other, but some people look down and see something strange. Their index finger and their ring finger land almost exactly even, as if someone drew a straight line across both tips. If that is what you see on your own hand right now, stay with this video, because in the next few minutes, you are going to learn exactly why that happened to you and not to almost everyone else standing beside you. The story of that strange match starts more than a century before anyone had ever heard the word DNA. In 1875, in the German university city of Freiburg, an anatomist named Alexander Ecker was working through a stack of hand measurements when he noticed something that did not fit. Men, more often than women, showed a ring finger that reached noticeably past the index finger. Women, more often than men, showed the two fingers landing close to level, sometimes with the index finger even winning out. Ecker wrote the observation down, published it in a small anthropology journal, and then the findings sat there for decades, almost forgotten. In 1888, an American anthropologist named Frank Baker measured hands again and found the same split. Still, nobody understood why it happened. It was treated as a curiosity, a footnote about anatomy, filed away with no explanation attached. That silence lasted more than 100 years. Then, in 1998, a British researcher named John Manning, working out of the University of Liverpool, published a paper that changed everything. Manning and his team had measured the hands of hundreds of people and cross-referenced those measurements against something almost nobody had ever tried to compare them to before: hormone levels. What they found sent a jolt through the field. The ratio between the index finger and the ring finger was not random. It tracked, with real statistical weight, against testosterone. Manning gave the measurement a name that stuck. He called it the 2D to 4D ratio, the second digit divided by the fourth digit, index over ring. And almost overnight, a piece of anatomy that had been ignored since the 1800s became one of the most measured traits in human biology. Within a decade, hundreds of studies were being published every year, all chasing the same two questions. What is this ratio actually measuring? And why does it sit exactly where it sits on any one person's hand? The original 1998 paper did not stop at hormones alone. Manning's team also compared digit ratio against sperm counts and fertility markers in adult men, and found that men with lower ratios tended to show higher sperm concentrations. An early hint that this hand measurement was somehow tangled up with reproductive biology at a much deeper level than anyone had suspected. That single paper opened a door, and within a few years, researchers were testing the ratio against everything from athletic performance to risk-taking behavior to musical ability, chasing the same underlying question from a dozen different directions at once. Here is why the number matters so much. If your ring finger reaches past your index finger, your ratio comes out below 1, a pattern researchers came to call the low ratio, or the more masculinized hand. If your index finger reaches past your ring finger, your ratio sits above 1, called the high ratio, or the more feminized hand. And if the two fingers land almost perfectly even, your ratio sits right around 1, 0, dead center between the two. That center group, the equal-fingered group, is the one that kept pulling researchers back in because, unlike almost every other trait on the human body, this one does not move. Think about how unusual that is. Your weight rises and falls. Your face changes across decades. Your muscles build with training and fade without it. But the relationship between your index finger and your ring finger is set once, during a narrow stretch before you are even born. And then it never changes again for the rest of your life. The ratio you have as a small child is the ratio you will have as an old man or woman. Nothing you eat, nothing you lift, nothing you do to your body afterward moves it by a measurable amount. It is one of the only visible features on your entire body that gets locked in before birth and stays frozen until death. And that permanence is exactly what turned it from a curiosity into a tool, because a trait that cannot be faked, trained, or aged into something else is a trait scientists can actually trust. So when researchers finally figured out what sets that number, they were not explaining a quirk of the hand. They were reading a message that had been sealed shut before you ever took a breath. And for the people with equal fingers, that message turned out to be the most interesting one on record. The window where it happens is astonishingly short. Somewhere around the 8th week of pregnancy, when the developing fetus is barely the size of a lime, the hand is still taking shape, with the fingers separating out of a flat paddle of tissue. During that exact stretch, the body is flooded with two competing hormones, testosterone and estrogen, and the balance between them in that narrow window quietly decides the shape your hand will carry for the rest of your life. More testosterone relative to estrogen during that window, and the ring finger stretches out past the index, giving you a lower ratio. More estrogen relative to testosterone, and the two fingers come out close to even, pushing the ratio up toward that balanced 1. 0 mark. The equal hand is not a random glitch. It is the physical signature of a womb where neither hormone pulled decisively ahead. The timing is brutally precise. This is not a hormone bath spread across 9 months. It is a matter of weeks, and once that window closes, the ratio is locked. Whatever the balance happened to be during those specific days becomes permanent. That is the entire reason the number never shifts again after birth. The decision was made early, fast, and exactly once. For years, this stayed a correlation, and correlation is not proof. Researchers kept noticing that people with more masculinized hormone histories tended to have lower ratios, but noticing a pattern is not the same as finding the mechanism underneath it. The breakthrough came from a study published in 2011 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by a researcher named Zhengui Zheng, working with Martin Cohn. They looked directly at developing mouse embryos and studied the actual receptors inside the growing paw, the docking points where testosterone and estrogen physically attach to a cell and trigger growth. When they knocked out the estrogen receptor, the fourth digit grew longer and the ratio dropped, producing a more masculinized paw. When they knocked out the androgen receptor instead, blocking testosterone's effect, the fourth digit growth slowed and the digits evened out toward a higher, more balanced ratio. They were watching the actual mechanism happen in real time, at the cellular level, while the paw was still forming. That was the moment the digit ratio stopped being a curiosity and became hard, mechanistic science. There is a reason the fourth digit responds so strongly. Researchers had already identified that the genes controlling this whole process belong to a very old, very fundamental family called the Hox genes, short for homeobox genes. If your DNA is an instruction manual for how a body gets laid out, the Hox genes are the section handling architecture. They are ancient, shared across nearly every animal with a segmented body plan, from insects to fish to humans, and they decide what structure goes where, including how each finger grows out from the hand. Two clusters in particular, HOXA and HOXD, sit at the center of finger development, switching on during that same narrow prenatal window and helping determine how far each digit stretches. When those genes are damaged or missing entirely, the consequences are severe. Extra fingers, fused fingers, malformed limbs, which tells you just how load-bearing the system really is. Small, ordinary variations in these genes and in the switches that turn them on and off change how sensitive each finger is to testosterone and estrogen. The fourth digit tends to carry a heavier concentration of androgen receptors than the second digit, so when testosterone is running high during that window, the ring finger has more places to catch it, and it grows the most. When testosterone is running low relative to estrogen, that advantage disappears, and the two fingers grow at closer to the same rate, producing the equal pattern. There was one more piece of proof, and it came directly from human infants rather than mice. Researchers found a way to measure the actual hormone levels a developing baby had been exposed to by sampling the amniotic fluid surrounding it during pregnancy, a technique used in a landmark study led by Svetlana Lechmaya and Simon Baron-Cohen. Years later, they went back and measured the digit ratios of those same children. The prediction held. Higher amniotic testosterone relative to estrogen tracked with a lower ratio later in childhood. This was the human confirmation of what the mouse studies had already shown at the cellular level. A hormone measurement taken before a child could even walk was already forecasting the shape of the hand that child would carry for life. This is what makes the digit ratio such an unusual scientific tool. Almost every other window into prenatal development slams shut the moment a baby is born. You cannot go back decades later and measure the hormone environment someone was bathed in before birth. But the hand keeps the receipt. It holds onto that hormonal signature permanently, in a form anyone can read with nothing more than a ruler. But knowing that hormones set the ratio only pushed the real mystery back one more step, because something has to decide how much testosterone or estrogen floods that window for any individual. And something has to decide how many receptors each finger even carries to begin with. Two babies can sit in two different wombs and come out with two completely different hands. So something is steering the whole process from above the hormones themselves, and that something is inherited code. The receptors, the sensitivity, the entire hormonal machine, all of it traces back to genes passed down through families. Twin studies made this unmistakable. When researchers compared identical twins, who share essentially all of their DNA, their digit ratios matched far more closely than the ratios of fraternal twins, who share only about half. The tighter the genetic match between two people, the tighter their finger match. That is the signature of a trait shaped heavily by inheritance. Your ratio did not begin with you. It is an echo carried down a line of ancestors stretching back further than any family tree you could draw by hand. So step back and look at the full chain. Genes set the sensitivity of the receptors. That sensitivity decides how the fingers respond to the hormone balance during the window. The hormone balance during the window locks the ratio permanently. And the genes sitting at the very top of that chain, the ones deciding sensitivity in the first place, were themselves inherited from parents and their parents, and so on, back through history. The moment researchers followed that thread all the way up, they stopped studying biology and started studying ancestry. Because a trait that gets set before birth, frozen for an entire lifetime, and passed down generation after generation is rare. It is a genetic signature, and unlike something like eye color, this one leaves a physical record that anyone can read on a living person in any country on Earth without a single lab test. All it takes is a ruler and a hand. So researchers did exactly that. They started measuring hands across entire populations. For most of history, everyone assumed a trait this basic would look roughly the same everywhere. A finger is a finger. But when the measurements were laid side by side, population by population, the averages did not line up. One of the clearest studies came from Manning's own team in 2004, when they measured children across 4 distinct populations: Berber children from Morocco, Uyghur and Han, children from northwest China, and Afro-Caribbean children from Jamaica. The results were not noise. Han Chinese children carried the highest average ratio of the entire sample, the most balanced, most equal fingered pattern. Berber and Uyghur children landed in the middle. Jamaican children of West African descent carried the lowest average ratio, the most masculinized pattern in the entire study. That was not a one-off. Since then, meta-analyses, pulling together dozens of studies out of China, have repeatedly found the same shape to the data, average ratios among Han Chinese populations running higher than European and Middle Eastern samples, which in turn run higher than Black African and Afro-Caribbean populations. Some of these comparisons found average right-hand ratios among Chinese men sitting close to 0. 97, with women measuring only slightly higher. And even inside a single country, the pattern showed up again. One comparison inside northwest China measured Uyghur and Han populations living in the very same region and still found a measurable gap between them, which told researchers that geography and climate alone could not be the whole explanation. Latitude and sunlight exposure have both been proposed as possible, contributing factors over the years. But when researchers tested those ideas directly against populations living at the same latitude with different ancestry, the latitude explanation kept coming up weak, leaving inherited genetics as the far stronger signal running underneath the pattern. Now, a word of caution here, because this is exactly where people online get careless. A population average is not a rule about any individual sitting in that population. It is a center of gravity. Inside every single group researchers have ever measured, you find the full range of hands, low ratios, high ratios, and everything in between. What shifts from one population to another is where the middle of that spread sits, not what any one person's hand has to look like. Nudge that average a little in one direction, and across millions of people, that small nudge becomes a visible statistical trend, even though plenty of individuals sit nowhere near it. Researchers have also flagged real limits in this data. Some of the underlying logic connecting genital development to finger development in the original theory has been criticized as resting on studies of gonad tissue that were not quite the same tissue being discussed. And not every study measuring ethnic differences has agreed on the size or even the direction of the gap. This is contested, actively studied territory, not settled fact carved in stone. Still, the pattern that kept surfacing across measurement after measurement, decade after decade, pointed toward East Asian populations carrying, on average, a more balanced, more equal-fingered hand than many other regions measured around the world. Which meant the equal finger stopped being just a hormone story. It became a geography story, written into the deep ancestral history of where a person's line traces back to. The scale of this mapping effort is easy to underestimate. Over roughly 3 decades, research teams have measured tens of thousands of hands across dozens of countries, in hunter-gatherer communities and dense modern cities, across children and adults, across nearly every populated continent. And when all of that data gets stacked together, the regional shape of the pattern keeps holding. It is not the artifact of one lab or one small sample. It is a signal that has survived being tested again and again by different researchers, using different measurement methods on different populations. And that kind of durability is rare in a field this contested. But averages alone only describe what is happening. They do not explain why it is happening. To answer why, researchers had to trace the pattern all the way down to the Hox genes themselves and to the DNA sequences controlling how active those genes are in any given person. Small inherited variations in those control sequences change how strongly the 4th digit responds to testosterone during that narrow prenatal window. And those variations are not scattered evenly across humanity. They cluster. They travel along the same migration routes that carried nearly every other inherited human trait, from skin tone to how the body processes milk sugar in adulthood. To understand how that clustering happened, you have to zoom out to the whole story of how humans spread across the planet. Every living person descends from populations that began in Africa and then moved outward across tens of thousands of years, splitting again and again as groups pushed into new territory. Some lines moved north into what would become Europe. Some moved east across the vast stretch of Asia. Some crossed land bridges and coastlines into the Pacific Islands and eventually into the Americas. Every time a group broke away and settled somewhere new, it carried only a slice of the total genetic variation that existed in the larger population, and over thousands of years of relative isolation, that slice drifted on its own, independent of what was happening anywhere else. Certain gene variants became common in one region simply because of who happened to carry them into that region, and how that population grew from there, not because those variants were somehow superior. The genes controlling finger growth rode along on that same current of migration and drift, and the variants nudging the hand toward the equal pattern ended up concentrated in lineages connected to East Asia. Because Hox genes are so ancient and so fundamental to how every animal body gets built, the specific variants shaping finger length in humans have likely been riding through certain lineages for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, long before written history, long before the first permanent settlements were ever built. If you carry the equal finger pattern, there is a real chance you are carrying a version of these regulatory sequences that was already spreading through a specific ancestral population many thousands of generations before you were born. That is not a small thing sitting quietly in your hand. It is a line stretching back into prehistory. And it is worth saying plainly that this pattern concentrating toward East Asian ancestry carries no value judgment whatsoever. It sits in exactly the same category as lactose tolerance concentrating in certain pastoral populations, or sickle cell trait concentrating in populations from regions with high historical malaria exposure. Every region on Earth carries its own quiet genetic signatures written into traits most people never think twice about. From earwax type to how quickly the body metabolizes certain medications, this one just happens to be visible. Something you can hold up to the light and measure with your own eyes in about 3 seconds. So when you look down and see two fingers landing at almost exactly the same length, you are not looking at coincidence. You're looking at the visible end of a long chain, running from a specific gene variant, through a hormone balance struck during a few weeks before birth, through your parents and their parents, all the way back to ancestral populations that carried this same pattern across the world, long before anyone alive today existed. Your hand is holding a piece of that history in plain sight. Now here's the part that has to be said honestly, because the science demands it. Your fingers are not a DNA test. A single hand cannot tell you your exact ancestry with certainty. Plenty of people with European or African heritage carry equal fingers too. Plenty of people with East Asian heritage carry a low ratio. What the research shows is a tilt, a shifted probability across large populations, not a verdict about any one person. Your fingers are one clue folded into a far larger genetic picture, not proof of where your family came from. Anyone telling you your hand alone proves your bloodline is overselling a real but limited signal. But the flip side matters just as much. This is a real, measurable, inherited signal, and it does trace back to something ancient. That is a great deal more than anyone believed just a few decades ago, back when this measurement was dismissed as an anatomical coincidence with no explanation attached. The research has not stopped at Ancestry either. Because the ratio is set by that same prenatal hormone balance, scientists have gone on to ask what else that hormone exposure might line up with. A lower ratio, the pattern associated with more prenatal testosterone, has been linked in various studies to certain patterns in spatial reasoning and to athletic performance, which is why so much of the early research focused heavily on elite athletes. A higher ratio, the more balanced pattern associated with relatively more prenatal estrogen, has been linked in some studies to different patterns in verbal ability and other cognitive measures. Some researchers have also explored possible links to certain long-term health outcomes, since the same hormone exposure shaping the hand is also shaping the developing brain and body during that same window. Studies on elite competitors, from sprinters to fencers to football players, have repeatedly reported lower average ratios than the general population, though the size of that gap varies considerably from sport to sport and from study to study, and plenty of world-class athletes measure nowhere close to the group average. None of this is destiny, and none of it should be treated as certainty either. These are faint statistical patterns that only show up when you average across enormous numbers of people. On any single individual, they mean almost nothing. A finger cannot predict your future any more than it can choose your career for you. What it can do, reliably, is point back to that same quiet window before birth. It is a signature of a moment, not a prophecy about a life, and holding on to that distinction is exactly what separates real science from the exaggerated claims that tend to get piled on top of it online. It is worth being precise about what equal actually means here, because there is a meaningful difference between the three patterns. When the ring finger clearly overhangs the index, that sits firmly in the low ratio group, shaped by a strong relative testosterone signal during the window. When the index finger clearly overhangs the ring, that sits at the high end, shaped by a weaker relative testosterone signal. But the equal hand, where the two tips land almost perfectly level, sits right at the balance point between them. It is not an extreme in either direction. It is the finely balanced middle of the entire scale, and it happens to be the pattern that shows up more frequently as research traces ancestry toward East Asia. If you want to check your own hand with any real accuracy, do it the way researchers actually do it in these studies. Look at the palm side of your right hand, since the right hand tends to show the effect more strongly and consistently than the left in most published samples. Find the crease at the very base of the index finger and the crease at the very base of the ring finger, and measure from those creases straight to the fingertips. Do not eyeball it from the back of your hand, where the knuckles distort everything. Then compare the two lengths directly. If they land within a hair of one another, you sit inside the balanced, equal-fingered group this entire video has been tracing back through history. And that is what makes this whole thing so strange to sit with. A feature you have looked at your entire life, so ordinary you probably never gave it a second thought, has quietly been carrying all of this the entire time. The balance of hormones in a womb you cannot remember. A set of ancient genes handed down a line you cannot fully trace by name. An echo of ancestral populations that lived and migrated across the planet tens of thousands of years before you were ever born. All of it folded into two fingers you can measure in about 3 seconds. You have been carrying a piece of evidence this whole time and simply calling it a hand. There is something genuinely humbling in that. People spend real money on ancestry kits, mail off saliva samples, and wait weeks for a report to tell them where they come from. And the entire time, a rougher version of that same report has been sitting at the end of their own arm, written into bone and cartilage, needing nothing but a moment of attention to be read. So hold your hand up one more time. Look at those two fingers again. If they land equal, level, matched almost perfectly, you are not looking at nothing. You are looking at a record, one written before your first breath, handed down by people whose names you will likely never know, carried across a map far older than any country ever drawn onto it. Your hand has been quietly telling this story your entire life. It just took the DNA a little over 100 years to finally translate it.